I remember the day the invitation came. It was a chilly Saturday morning, and I was sipping my coffee while flipping through the newspaper. The usual hum of our quiet neighborhood filled the air. My wife, Emily, was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. The doorbell rang, startling me out of my morning routine. I got up to answer it and found a neatly dressed courier holding a fancy envelope. He handed it to me with a polite nod before heading back to his van. "Who's that?" Emily called from the kitchen. "Just a courier," I replied, examining the envelope. It was cream-colored with elegant gold lettering. "Looks fancy." I walked back to the kitchen, holding the envelope up for Emily to see. Her eyes widened slightly as she dried her hands on a towel and took it from me. "It's from the Hendersons," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of excitement and nervousness. "They're hosting a formal ball next month." "A ball?" I raised an eyebrow. "Like with tuxedos and gowns?" "Yes," she nodded, her fingers tracing the gold lettering. "It's a big deal. The Hendersons are known for their grand parties. This will be our first time attending one." I watched as a smile flickered on her lips, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by a look of worry. She turned away, busying herself with the breakfast again. "Are you okay?" I asked, sensing her unease. "I'm fine," she said quickly, but I could tell something was bothering her. Emily was usually excited about social events, always eager to dress up and be the life of the party. Her hesitation was unusual. 2 weeks passed, and Emily's anxiety grew. She was constantly checking her phone, her smile no longer reaching her eyes. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, she turned to me with a forced cheerfulness. "Do you really want to go to this ball?" she asked. "It's okay if you'd rather stay home and relax." I was taken aback. Emily never missed an opportunity to go out, and she always dragged me along, listing 100 chores I could do if I chose to stay home. But this time, she was suggesting that I relax. "Are you sure?" I asked, trying to understand her sudden change in attitude. "You usually love these things." She shrugged, her eyes darting away. "I just thought you might want a night off." I reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "If you want to go, we'll go. Besides, it sounds like it could be fun." Emily smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Okay," she said softly. "We'll go." As the day of the ball approached, Emily's behavior grew even more erratic. She was glued to her phone, tapping away furiously and often looking worried. One afternoon, while we were driving, her phone connected to the car's Bluetooth, and she suddenly became very nervous. She fumbled with the phone, pressing the power button repeatedly, but the Bluetooth wouldn't disconnect. Her face turned pale, and she stared out the window, avoiding my eyes. "Everything okay?" I asked, glancing at her. "Yes, yes," she replied quickly, her voice shaky. "Just work stuff." Her unusual behavior gnawed at me. Emily had always been open with me, so her secretiveness was both new and troubling. I decided not to press her further, hoping she would open up when she was ready. But that night, as we sat down to dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Emily picked at her food, barely eating, her mind clearly elsewhere. "Emily," I said gently, "you know you can talk to me, right?" "About anything." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sadness. For a moment, I thought she might finally tell me what was on her mind. But she simply nodded and forced a smile. "I know," she said softly. "I know." And with that, we finished our meal in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily between us. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that the upcoming ball would be a turning point. Little did I know just how right I was. The tension between Emily and me had become almost unbearable. Her unusual behavior was like a dark cloud hanging over us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. One Friday evening, about a week before the ball, Emily and I were heading to the grocery store. She had been glued to her phone all day, her fingers moving rapidly across the screen, her face a mask of worry. As we drove, her phone was connected to the car's Bluetooth, playing her favorite playlist. Suddenly, a notification popped up, and her whole demeanor changed. She became visibly anxious, her hands trembling as she fumbled to disconnect the Bluetooth. But the more she tried, the more frantic she became. "Emily, what's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm despite the rising worry in my chest. "Nothing, it's fine," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She finally gave up, her face pale as she stared out the window, her knuckles white from gripping the edge of her seat. "It's obviously not nothing," I said gently. "You've been on edge for weeks now. Talk to me." She didn't respond. Instead, she sighed heavily and turned her gaze to the passing scenery. The rest of the drive was silent, filled only with the hum of the car engine and the occasional beep of her phone. When we arrived at the store, Emily jumped out quickly, leaving her phone on the passenger seat. I sat there for a moment, my mind racing. Curiosity and concern gnawed at me, and before I knew it, I found myself picking up her phone. I hesitated, feeling a pang of guilt. But my need to know what was troubling my wife won out. I unlocked her phone and went straight to her messages, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then I checked her emails. There it was, an open email from a clinic, stating she had test results to check online. My heart pounded as I clicked the link. The words stared back at me, almost mocking in their clarity. Positive test result for a sexually transmitted disease. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. Emily had always been so careful, so faithful, or so I thought. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. How long had she known? Why hadn't she told me? Most importantly, how had she contracted it? I was still in a daze when Emily returned with the groceries. She glanced at her phone, then at me, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she suspected something. "Did you find everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound normal. "Yeah," she replied, her voice tight. "Why do you ask?" "Just making conversation," I said, forcing a smile. We drove home in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken words. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed everything I had read, everything I had seen in her behavior. The next morning, I knew I had to dig deeper. When Emily was in the shower, I picked up her phone again. This time, I went straight to her WhatsApp. My hands shook as I scrolled through her messages until I found the ones I dreaded most. Conversations with a man named Michael. The messages were explicit, leaving no room for doubt. They had been meeting secretly for months. My heart sank as I read Emily's words, her fear of having to tell me about her diagnosis, and Michael's cold suggestions to either lie or leave me. When Emily came out of the shower, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, her phone in my hand. She stopped in her tracks, her face draining of color. "Who is Michael?" I asked quietly. She didn't answer, just stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. "Emily, who is he?" I repeated, my voice breaking. She took a deep breath, tears welling up in her eyes. "He's my boss," she admitted. "It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," I said, holding up her phone. I read the messages, all of them. Emily burst into tears, sinking to the floor. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I never meant for any of this to happen." I felt a mix of anger and sorrow. Why didn't you tell me? About the diagnosis, about everything. "I was scared," she whispered. "I didn't want to lose you." You lost me the moment you decided to lie, I said, standing up. We need to talk. But not now. I need some time to think. I left the room, leaving her crying on the floor. I needed space to process everything, to figure out what to do next. The ball was still a week away, but I knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days leading up to the ball were a blur of confusion and pain. Emily and I moved around each other like ghosts, our once warm and loving home now filled with an icy silence. I couldn't shake the image of her tear-streaked face, the sound of her sobs echoing in my mind. I spent a lot of time thinking, trying to make sense of everything. I thought about our years together, the good times and the bad. I thought about the trust we had built and how it had been shattered in an instant. I knew I had to confront Emily again, but this time I needed answers. One evening, I found her sitting on the porch, staring into the sunset. The light painted her face in soft hues, but there was a deep sadness in her eyes. I took a deep breath and joined her. "Emily, we need to talk," I said gently, breaking the silence. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and regret. "I know," she replied softly. I sat down beside her, the weight of the conversation heavy between us. "I need to understand why," I began. "Why did you do it? Why him?" Emily sighed, tears welling up in her eyes. "It wasn't planned," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It just happened. Michael was there for me when I felt lost. I didn't mean for it to go this far." I felt a surge of anger mixed with sorrow. "But you kept it going," I said, my voice trembling. "You lied to me. You put our health at risk. Why didn't you stop?" She looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously. "I was scared," she admitted. "I knew I was making a mistake, but I couldn't face the consequences. And when I found out about the disease, I panicked. I didn't know how to tell you." "How long has this been going on?" I asked, my heart heavy. "A few months," she confessed. "It started as just conversations, then it became something more. I never meant to hurt you." "You did hurt me," I said, my voice breaking. "You shattered my trust. How am I supposed to move past this?" Emily reached out to touch my hand, but I pulled away. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know the truth." I stood up, the pain too much to bear. "I don't know what to do, Emily," I said, looking down at her. "But I can't keep living like this. I need time to think, to figure out what comes next." She nodded, wiping her tears. "Take all the time you need," she said softly. "I understand." The night of the ball arrived, and despite everything, we decided to go. Emily and I dressed in silence, the tension between us almost suffocating. She wore a beautiful blue gown, but the sadness in her eyes dulled its brilliance. As we arrived at the grand venue, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The ballroom was filled with elegantly dressed guests, laughter and music echoing through the air. But all I could think about was the betrayal that had brought us here. Emily stayed close to me, her hand trembling in mine. We found our table and sat down, the weight of our secrets heavy between us. The night dragged on, each moment filled with forced smiles and empty conversations. Then I saw him. Michael, standing across the room, his eyes locking onto Emily's. My blood boiled, and I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure. Emily noticed and squeezed my hand, a silent plea for calm. "I need some air," I muttered, standing up abruptly. I made my way to the terrace, the cool night air a welcome relief. I leaned against the railing, trying to gather my thoughts. The sound of footsteps behind me made me turn, and there he was. "Can we talk?" Michael asked, his voice cautious. "Talk?" I spat, anger flaring. "What is there to talk about?" He looked uncomfortable, but didn't back down. "I just wanted to explain," he said. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "Explain," I echoed, my voice rising. "You slept with my wife, lied to me, and now you want to explain." Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry," he said. "I never meant to hurt you. Emily and we made a mistake." "A mistake?" I said bitterly. "A mistake that cost me my marriage and my trust." He nodded, looking genuinely remorseful. "I know, and I'm sorry. I wish I could take it back." I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside me. "It's too late for that," I said quietly. "What's done is done." Michael nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I understand. For what it's worth, I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive her." I looked at him, the man who had caused me so much pain, and felt a strange sense of pity. "Forgiveness isn't that simple," I said, "but I appreciate the apology." With that, I turned and walked back inside, leaving Michael on the terrace. Emily was waiting for me, her eyes filled with questions. I nodded slightly, a silent assurance that everything was under control. The night continued, but the weight of the revelation hung over us. As we drove home in silence, I couldn't help but wonder what the future held. The trust had been broken, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. But one thing was clear: things would never be the same again. The night of the ball had finally arrived. Emily and I prepared in silence, the unspoken tension between us thick and suffocating. I adjusted my tie in the mirror, stealing glances at Emily as she carefully applied her makeup. She looked stunning in her blue gown, but the sadness in her eyes dimmed her beauty. As we drove to the grand venue, the car was filled with an uncomfortable silence. Emily stared out the window, lost in her thoughts, while I gripped the steering wheel, trying to keep my emotions in check. When we arrived, the venue was already buzzing with activity. Elegant couples in tuxedos and gowns mingled, laughter and music filling the air. We walked in hand, trying to present a united front despite the turmoil inside. The ballroom was magnificent, with crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the polished floor. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Emily and I found our table and sat down. She fidgeted with her clutch, her eyes darting around the room nervously. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside me. We made small talk with the other guests at our table, but my mind was elsewhere. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. Michael, standing near the bar, a drink in his hand. He looked confident and relaxed, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Emily. I felt a surge of anger and clenched my fists under the table. Emily noticed and placed a trembling hand on my arm. "Please, let's just get through this night," she whispered, her voice pleading. I nodded, forcing a smile. "All right," I said, though the tension was almost unbearable. The evening dragged on, each moment feeling like an eternity. I watched as Michael made his way through the crowd, charming and mingling with the guests. It took everything in me to stay seated and not confront him right then and there. When the music started, couples began to move to the dance floor. Michael approached our table, his eyes fixed on Emily. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "May I have this dance?" he asked, extending his hand to Emily. She glanced at me, her eyes begging for understanding. I nodded stiffly, and she took Michael's hand, allowing him to lead her to the dance floor. As they danced, I couldn't take my eyes off them. They moved gracefully, but there was a tension between them, an unease that everyone seemed to notice. I stood up, unable to watch any longer, and made my way to the bar. I ordered a drink, needing something to steady my nerves. As I sipped it, I felt a presence beside me. I turned to see a woman, one of the guests, looking at me with concern. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. I forced a smile. "Just needed a break," I said. She nodded, her eyes kind. "It's a lovely evening, but sometimes it can be overwhelming," she said. "I'm Clara, by the way." "Nice to meet you, Clara," I replied. "I'm John." We chatted for a bit, her presence a welcome distraction from the turmoil inside me. But my eyes kept drifting back to Emily and Michael. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Excuse me," I said to Clara, setting down my drink. I walked back to the dance floor, my heart pounding. Emily and Michael were still dancing, their movements stiffer now. I approached them, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Mind if I cut in?" I said, my voice tight. Michael looked at me, his smile faltering. "Of course," he said, stepping back. I took Emily's hand and she looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. We danced in silence, the music a distant background noise. "Why are you doing this?" I asked quietly. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted any of this." "Then why?" I pressed, my anger barely contained. "I don't know," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. I wish I could take it back." I sighed, the weight of her words pressing down on me. "We can't change the past," I said, "but we need to figure out where to go from here." The song ended, and we stood there, holding each other as the world moved around us. I knew this night was just the beginning of a long journey, one filled with pain, healing, and difficult choices. As we left the ballroom, hand in hand, I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Despite everything, maybe there was a way forward. But it would take time, honesty, and a lot of hard work. We drove home in silence, the events of the evening weighing heavily on us. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. We couldn't go back to the way things were. We could only move forward, one step at a time. The night of the ball had left me shaken, but it also gave me clarity. I knew what I needed to do. I couldn't let this betrayal fester in silence. It was time to confront the truth head-on, no matter how painful it might be. A few days after the ball, I found myself alone in our living room. Emily was at work, and the house was eerily quiet. I sat on the couch, her phone in my hand. My heart pounded as I unlocked it, determined to gather the evidence I needed. I went straight to her messages with Michael. The explicit texts, the secret plans, and the confirmation of their affair were all there. I took screenshots of everything, my hands shaking as I did. This was my proof, my way of exposing the truth. That evening, Emily came home, looking exhausted. She barely glanced at me as she walked past, heading straight for the kitchen. "Emily, we need to talk," I said, my voice firm. She paused, her back to me. "What is it now?" she asked, a hint of irritation in her voice. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the couch. She turned to face me, her eyes wary. She sat down slowly, her hands clasped in her lap. "I know everything," I said, holding up her phone. "I saw the messages." Her face went pale, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "I've got proof of your affair with Michael," I continued, "and I'm not going to keep this a secret anymore." "John, please," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Don't do this." "You didn't think about the consequences when you were sneaking around with him," I said, my anger boiling over. "Why should I protect you now?" I stood up, grabbing my own phone. "I'm posting the screenshots on your social media. Everyone will know the truth." "No, please," she cried, standing up and reaching for me. "Don't do this, John. I'm begging you." But I was resolute. I posted the screenshots on her Facebook and Instagram, along with a brief explanation of her betrayal. Almost immediately, the notifications started pouring in, likes, comments, and messages from friends and family who were shocked by the revelation. Emily collapsed onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. I watched her, a mix of anger and sadness churning inside me. I had loved her deeply, but she had shattered that love with her actions. Later that night, as the news spread, my phone rang. It was one of our friends, Mark. "John, what's going on?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I just saw Emily's posts." "It's true," I said, my voice heavy. "She's been having an affair with her boss. I couldn't keep it a secret anymore." "Man, I'm so sorry," Mark said. "If you need anything, just let me know." "Thanks, Mark," I replied, appreciating his support. As the night wore on, Emily's phone kept buzzing with messages and calls. She didn't answer any of them, just sat there staring blankly at the wall. The weight of her actions had finally caught up with her. The next morning, I woke up early and went downstairs. Emily was still on the couch, looking like she hadn't slept at all. She glanced up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "I'm leaving," I said simply. "I need some space to think." "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice trembling. "To a friend's place," I replied. "I don't know how long I'll be gone, but I need to figure out what to do next." She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry, John," she whispered. "I never meant for any of this to happen." "I know," I said, feeling a pang of sadness. "But it did. And now we have to deal with the consequences." I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. As I left, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The truth was out, and there was no going back. But maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward healing. As I drove away, I thought about the future. It was uncertain, filled with challenges and difficult decisions. But I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't let this betrayal define me. I would move forward, one step at a time, and find a way to rebuild my life. The days after I exposed Emily's affair were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions. I stayed with my friend Mark, who offered me a spare room and a listening ear. His support was a lifeline during those turbulent times. One morning, I woke up early and decided to call my doctor. The fear of having contracted the disease that Emily had weighed heavily on my mind. I made an appointment for that afternoon. "John, are you okay?" Mark asked as I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at my coffee. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm going to get tested today. I need to know if I'm healthy." Mark nodded, his expression serious. "Do you want me to come with you?" "No, I think I need to do this alone," I said, appreciating the offer, but knowing I needed to face this on my own. The doctor's office was quiet, the sterile smell filling the air as I sat in the waiting room. When the nurse called my name, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Dr. Harris, a kind middle-aged woman with a reassuring smile, greeted me in her office. "John, what brings you in today?" I took a deep breath and explained the situation. She listened patiently, then ordered a series of tests. "We'll get the results back in a few days," she said, her voice gentle. "In the meantime, try to take care of yourself. This is a difficult situation, but you're doing the right thing by getting tested." "Thank you, doctor," I said, feeling a bit of relief, knowing I was taking steps to address my health. The waiting was the hardest part. Each day felt like a year as I tried to keep myself busy. Mark and I talked often, and he did his best to distract me with sports on TV and weekend barbecues. On the third day, my phone rang. It was the doctor's office. "Hello, this is John," I answered, my heart racing. "John, this is Dr. Harris." "I have your test results," she said. "I'm happy to tell you that everything came back negative. You're in the clear." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Thank you, Dr. Harris. You have no idea what a relief that is. You're welcome, John. Take care of yourself, and if you need anything else, don't hesitate to call. I hung up the phone and slumped onto the couch, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. Mark walked in, saw my expression, and raised an eyebrow. Well, he asked. I'm clear, I said, a smile breaking through. I'm okay. Mark grinned and clapped me on the back. That's great news, man. We need to celebrate. How about a steak dinner tonight? I'd like that, I said, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. Despite the relief, I knew there were still unresolved issues with Emily. I had avoided her calls and texts, needing time to process everything. But I couldn't avoid her forever. That evening, after dinner, I decided to call her back. Hello. Emily's voice was hesitant, almost afraid. Hi, Emily. It's John, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. John, I'm so sorry, she said immediately. I've been trying to reach you. Hi, I don't know what to say. I got my test results back, I said, cutting to the chase. I'm clear. Oh, thank God, she breathed. I'm so relieved to hear that. Emily, we need to talk about what happens next, I said. We can't go on like this. I know, she said quietly. I've been thinking a lot about it too. I'm so sorry for everything I've done. I never meant to hurt you. I need some time, I said, my voice firm but not unkind. I need to figure out if I can ever trust you again. I'm not making any decisions right now, but I need space. I understand, she said, her voice breaking. Take all the time you need. I'll wait for your decision, whatever it is. We hung up, and I felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was a step toward healing. As the weeks passed, I started to rebuild my life. I focused on work, reconnecting with friends, and finding solace in new hobbies. Mark's unwavering support was invaluable, and I began to see a future where I could be happy again. One evening, as Mark and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. You know, John, you're stronger than you think, he said. This whole thing could have broken you, but you're still standing. I'm proud of you. Thanks, Mark, I said, feeling a warmth in my chest. I couldn't have done it without you. That's what friends are for, he replied, raising his beer in a toast. As I clinked my bottle against his, I felt a sense of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I knew I wasn't walking it alone. And for the first time in a long while, I believed that everything was going to be okay. The weeks turned into months, and slowly the wounds from Emily's betrayal began to heal. Life started to feel normal again, though it was a new kind of normal. I had found a small apartment closer to work and began filling it with things that made it feel like home. One Saturday morning, I decided to visit a local dog shelter. I had always wanted a dog, and now seemed like the perfect time to bring some new joy into my life. As I walked through the rows of wagging tails and hopeful eyes, one dog caught my attention. He was a medium-sized mutt with a patchy coat and soulful eyes that seemed to look right into my heart. Hey there, buddy, I said, kneeling down to his level. He wagged his tail and licked my hand, and I knew I had found my new companion. The shelter volunteer smiled. That's Max, she said. He's been here for a few months. Such a sweet dog, but he hasn't found the right home yet. I think he just did, I replied, scratching Max behind the ears. A few days later, Max and I settled into our new routine. He was a bundle of energy and affection, and his presence brought a sense of warmth and companionship I hadn't felt in a long time. One evening, as Max and I were walking through the park, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Emily. I hadn't heard from her in a while, and seeing her name on the screen gave me a jolt of mixed emotions. "Hey John, I hope you're doing well. I just wanted to let you know that I've moved to a new city. I got a job and I'm trying to start over. I'm really sorry for everything that happened. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday. Take care." I stood there for a moment, staring at the message. Max tugged at his leash, urging me to keep walking. I took a deep breath and typed a response. "Hi, Emily. I'm glad to hear you're doing well. I'm also moving on and finding my own path. I'm not sure about forgiveness, but I hope you find happiness and peace. Take care." I hit send and felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was a small step, but it was a step toward truly letting go of the past. As Max and I continued our walk, I ran into an old friend from college, Sarah. We hadn't seen each other in years, and it was a pleasant surprise to bump into her. "John, is that really you?" she exclaimed, a bright smile on her face. "Sarah, it's been ages," I said, grinning. "How have you been?" We caught up on old times and shared stories about our lives. It felt good to reconnect with someone from my past, someone who knew me before all the chaos. "Why don't we grab a coffee sometime and catch up properly?" Sarah suggested. "I'd like that," I replied, genuinely looking forward to it. A few days later, Sarah and I met at a cozy cafe downtown. We talked for hours, reminiscing about college days and sharing our recent experiences. She told me about her job as a teacher and how much she loved working with kids. "And what about you, John? How are you really doing?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. I took a sip of my coffee and thought for a moment. "I'm getting there," I said honestly. "It's been tough, but I'm finding my way. Getting Max was a great decision, and reconnecting with old friends like you has been a huge help." Sarah smiled warmly. "I'm glad to hear that. You deserve to be happy, John." As we walked out of the cafe, I felt a sense of hope. Life was far from perfect, but I was moving forward. I was building a new life, one step at a time. A few weeks later, I decided to host a small dinner party at my new apartment. I invited Mark, Sarah, and a few other close friends. It was a modest affair, but it felt good to have people around me who cared. As we sat around the table, laughing and sharing stories, I looked around at my friends and realized something important. Despite the pain and the betrayal, life had a way of moving on. It wasn't about forgetting the past, but about learning from it and growing stronger. After everyone left, I sat on the couch with Max by my side. I thought about the journey I had been on, the ups and downs, and the lessons learned. I felt grateful for the new beginnings and the possibilities that lay ahead. "Here's to new beginnings, Max," I said, raising my glass of water. Max wagged his tail, and I knew that no matter what the future held, I was ready to face it. I had friends, I had hope, and most importantly, I had myself. Life was moving forward, and so was I.